There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a farm in late October. It is not the silence of emptiness, it is the silence of waiting. The fields have been turned, the last of the harvest has been hauled in, the animals have been moved to their winter stalls, and if you walk the fence lines of almost any working farm in the American Midwest, the Great Plains, or the hill country of Appalachia, sometime between the 1930s and the 1960s, you would find the farmer doing something that, to an outsider, looked almost ridiculous. He would be crouching down beside his fence posts, pressing the heel of his palm against the wood near the ground, rocking it gently, watching the soil at the base, sometimes just staring at the way the post sat in the earth, not hammering, not repairing, just reading. Because to a man who had spent his life working the land, a fence post was not just a piece of wood driven into the ground. It was an instrument. It was a calendar. It was, if you knew what to look for, one of the most reliable early warning systems that nature ever gave to a farming family trying to survive a brutal American winter. And what those men were reading, crouching along their fence lines in the cold October air, was whether the ground beneath their feet intended to destroy them. To understand why a sinking or shifting fence post could tell a farmer that a hard winter was coming, you have to first understand what happens to soil when it freezes, and you have to understand it the way those farmers understood it, not from a textbook, but from watching it happen year after year on land they knew like the backs of their own hands. Water, as every schoolchild learns, expands when it freezes, but what that simple fact means when applied to the complex, layered, moisture-rich soil of a working farm field is something that takes years of observation to fully appreciate. When the ground temperature drops below 32 degrees Fahrenheit and holds there, the moisture trapped between soil particles begins to freeze. And as it freezes, it expands. This expansion is not uniform, it is not tidy. It works in layers, following moisture gradients and soil composition, and it pushes upward, with a force that is almost incomprehensible until you have seen what it can do. This process has a name that the old farmers knew well, even if they called it by different names depending on where they were from. Scientists call it frost heave. Farmers in Minnesota called it the ground pushing up. Farmers in Kentucky talked about the frost working. Farmers in Kansas said the earth was breathing. But whatever they called it, they all knew what it did to fence posts. A fence post driven into the ground in October, set deep enough to hold wire through a normal winter, could be lifted inches, sometimes half a foot or more, out of the ground by spring if the frost heave was severe enough. The ice lenses that formed in the soil underneath the post would push it upward with each freezing cycle. The post would rock. The soil around its base would crack and separate. And by March, a fence line that had been tight and true in the fall would be a leaning, tilting disaster. The wire sagging, and the posts canted at angles that made the whole structure look like it had been hit by something. But here is the part that the old farmers understood, that made the fence post a forecasting tool rather than just a maintenance headache. The severity of the frost heave in late autumn, in those first hard freezes of October and November, told them something about how deep and how persistent the cold was going to be. Because the frost heave was not just about temperature, it was about moisture, and moisture in the soil in late autumn was directly connected to the precipitation patterns of the coming winter season. His name was Earl Hutchins, and in the autumn of 1947, he was 52 years old, hay grain and hog farmer working 312 acres of black prairie soil in Champaign County, Illinois. He had been farming that same ground since he was 19, when his father had handed him the deed and a handshake and driven away in a rattling Ford truck toward a retirement in Springfield that lasted less than 3 years before the old man was dead. Earl had farmed through the drought years of the 1930s, through the grinding poverty of the Depression, through the labor shortage of the war years when half the young men in the county were overseas and the women and old men and boys who were left behind did the work of 3 people apiece. By the autumn of 1947, Earl Hutchins knew his land. He knew the way the water table moved beneath the south field in March. He knew which corner of the north pasture stayed wet 3 weeks longer than the rest after a rain. He knew where the clay subsoil pushed up close enough to the surface to make the corn grow short and pale even in a good year. And he knew how to read his fence posts. The first week of November 1947, Earl walked his fence lines the way he did every year. He carried a small pry bar and a hand tamper, not because he expected to do major repairs, but because having them in his hands gave him a reason to stop at each post and make the movements that let him feel what the soil was doing. He would work the pry bar gently against the base of the post, feeling for looseness. He would press his palm against the wood and rock it. He would crouch and look at the soil line, checking for the telltale crack that appeared when the ground had already begun to push. What he found that November morning troubled him. The soil was moving earlier than he had ever seen it move, and the movement was not shallow. When he worked his pry bar into the ground beside the corner posts in the south pasture, he could feel the frost already reaching down 8 or 9 inches, and the moisture content was high, higher than he could remember seeing it that early in the season. The weeds that grew along the base of the wire fence, the kind that held soil moisture like a sponge, were already showing the grey-white color that meant the frost had hit their roots hard. And the posts themselves, the older ones that had been in the ground for 8 or 10 years, the ones that had gone through enough freeze-thaw cycles to have some looseness in them already, were moving, not falling, not dramatically failing, just shifting, in the way that told a man who knew what to look for that the ground beneath them was already under tremendous pressure. Earl straightened up from his crouch at the far corner of the south pasture and looked out across the stubble field toward the grey November sky. He did not consult a newspaper. He did not call the county extension agent. He did not wait for a radio forecast, though he would listen to one that evening on the big Zenith console in the front room, the way he listened to it every night. He made his calculation based on what the ground was telling him, cross-referenced against everything else he had observed that autumn, the thickness of the husks on the corn, the behavior of the woolly bear caterpillars he had seen crossing the road in October, the early and heavy mast crop of acorns in the woodlot, the way the hogs had been building their bedding up deeper and tighter than usual for the past 3 weeks. Earl Hutchins went home, sat down at the kitchen table across from his wife Dorothy, and told her that they needed to lay in more coal before the end of the month. He told her the winter was going to come early and hit hard and stay a long time. He told her to add another 200 pounds of dried beans and another 100 pounds of cornmeal to the cellar stores. He told their oldest son, Raymond, who was 23 and doing most of the heavy work on the farm by then, that they needed to pull the tractor into the equipment shed and bank the foundation of the shed with hay bales before the 1st of December. Dorothy looked at her husband for a long moment and then wrote a grocery list. Raymond banked the equipment shed with hay bales on the 28th of November. The winter of 1947 and 48 was one of the most severe in the recorded history of central Illinois. Snow came in early December and did not leave until late February. The temperature dropped to minus 17 degrees Fahrenheit in January. The coal pile that Earl had ordered resupplied was nearly exhausted by February 1st. The farmers who had not laid in extra stores, the ones who had looked at the same October and November and seen nothing unusual, spent February driving 40 miles on ice-covered roads to buy coal and feed at prices that had tripled because everyone needed it at the same time. Earl Hutchins's hogs came through the winter in better condition than most of his neighbors. His equipment started in the spring. His fence posts needed repair, but not catastrophic replacement. He had read the signs correctly, acted on what he read, and survived another winter that broke less prepared men. The science behind what Earl Hutchins was doing, what all those fence line farmers were doing when they crouched in the cold and pressed their palms against weathered wood, is the science of frost heave, soil moisture dynamics, and phenological observation. Though the farmers themselves would not have used those words, they would have said they were paying attention, and in a deeper sense, that is exactly what it was. Frost heave occurs when the water in the soil freezes and forms what soil scientists call ice lenses, horizontal layers of ice that grow as they draw liquid water upward through capillary action toward the freezing front. This process, called cryosuction, can generate upward pressures of several hundred pounds per square foot. A fence post buried 2 feet into the ground has thousands of pounds of upward force applied to it during a severe freeze. The only thing holding it down is the weight of the post itself and the friction of the soil around it. And when the soil is ice, that friction is dramatically reduced. The key variable is moisture. Dry soil heaves less. Saturated soil heaves more, sometimes dramatically so. A soil that has absorbed a wet autumn, heavy September and October rains, a late-season soaking that drives water deep into the profile, is primed for violent frost heave when the hard cold arrives. And that same wet autumn, that same saturated soil, is often associated with the weather patterns that produce severe winters in the continental interior of North America. This is not a coincidence. It is not folk superstition dressed up in hindsight. The atmospheric patterns that drive heavy late autumn precipitation in the Midwest, persistent low-pressure systems, a displaced jet stream, the particular configuration of Pacific and Gulf moisture that brings heavy October rains to Illinois and Iowa and Indiana, are associated with the large-scale circulation patterns that produce cold, persistent snowy winters across the same region. The correlation is not perfect. It is not a law of physics, but it is a real statistical tendency, and farmers who had observed it over decades were using genuine empirical data when they connected wet autumn soil to hard winters ahead. When Earl Hutchins felt his fence posts moving in early November, and registered that the frost was already deep and the soil was saturated, he was picking up the downstream signal of the same atmospheric pattern that would produce the brutal winter ahead. He did not know that. He could not have articulated it in those terms. But the connection he had learned to draw, wet, early frost heave means a hard winter coming, was based on real observation of real correlations played out over decades on the same piece of ground. That is what made it reliable. Not magic, not folklore. Decades of careful, attentive, unwritten science conducted by men and women who could not afford to be wrong. The fence post was not the only instrument in the farmer's winter forecasting toolkit, but it was one of the most reliable because it was quantitative in a way that most of the other indicators were not. You could feel how much the post had moved. You could compare it to the same post in the same ground in previous years. You could run your hand down the post to the soil line and feel whether the crack at the base was 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 inch or more. You were measuring, in the most direct possible way, the amount of work the frost had already done. Other signs confirmed or extended the fence post reading. Farmers watched the behavior of their animals with the attention of researchers. Hogs, in particular, were considered excellent winter forecasters because their response to changing conditions was so direct and unambiguous. A hog does not theorize about the coming winter. A hog responds to it. When hogs begin building their bedding higher and tighter and deeper in their stalls, when they start hauling corn shucks and straw into the far corners of the pen and packing them with unusual urgency, the farmer watching them is watching an animal that has been selecting for cold weather survival for thousands of years respond to stimuli, air pressure, temperature gradients, humidity, perhaps infrasound or barometric cues that human senses cannot detect, that precede severe cold. The Farmer's Almanac, which had been published since 1792, codified many of these folk observations into print, giving them a kind of institutional authority that let farmers share and compare notes across regions. But the almanac itself drew on the same pool of accumulated rural observation that the farmers were practicing. It was not that the almanac taught farmers to read nature. It was that the almanac confirmed what farmers were already reading and gave them a common vocabulary for discussing what they saw. Woolly bear caterpillars, the banded rust and black larvae of the Isabella tiger moth, became one of the most famous natural forecasting symbols in American rural culture. The folk belief held that the width of the rust-colored middle band predicted winter severity. A wide band meant a mild winter, a narrow band meant a hard one. Entomologists have studied this claim repeatedly, and the verdict is, at best, that the correlation is weak and inconsistent. But the woolly bear observation tells us something important about how the system of folk forecasting worked. It was not any single sign that farmers relied upon. It was the constellation of signs read together, cross-checked against each other, weighted by experience. A woolly bear with a narrow band, combined with early moving fence posts, combined with heavy mast production in the woodlot, combined with hogs packing their bedding tight. That was a forecast. No single element was definitive. The pattern was. Across the country, in different farming regions, the specific signs varied, but the underlying method was the same. In the dairy country of Vermont and upstate New York, Farmers watched the height at which yellowjackets and hornets built their nests. Nests built high in trees were said to signal heavy snow ahead. The insects, the thinking went, were instinctively building above the expected snowline. Whether this correlation is real or not, farmers who watched for it were doing something valuable regardless. They were paying close and systematic attention to the natural world around them, and the habit of attention itself made them better observers of everything. In the cotton and tobacco country of the Upper South, Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, farmers talked about the thickness of the shucks on the corn as a winter indicator. Corn that matured with unusually thick, tight husks was said to be the land's way of warning that the cold ahead would be fierce. Again, the mechanistic connection is not perfectly established by science, but it is not dismissed either. Plant development in the weeks before first frost is influenced by temperature and photoperiod, and the same late-season conditions that encourage thick husk development may correlate with the atmospheric setup for hard winters. Farmers were picking up a real signal in a noisy system, using imperfect instruments that they had calibrated over lifetimes. In the wheat country of Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, where the winters could be of a brutality that still staggers the imagination, blizzards that arrived without warning and killed men who were caught 100 yards from their own front doors, the fence post reading was a matter of particular urgency because the consequences of being wrong were so extreme. Plow sod-busting family on the high plains in the 1930s had almost no margin for error. The winters of 1932, 33, and 36 were killers in the literal sense, and farmers who had read the signs correctly and laid in extra fuel and extra feed survived them. Farmers who had not sometimes did not. The Dust Bowl years, which coincided with some of the harshest winters in Plains history, produced a generation of farmers who were, of necessity, the most careful readers of natural signs that America had ever seen. They had to be. The land was already trying to kill them. They could not afford the additional vulnerability of being surprised by the weather. Consider the experience of farming families in the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico during the worst years of the 1930s, when the dust storms were at their peak. These families, many of them recent arrivals who had moved to the plains during the boom years of the 1920s, lured by cheap land and good wheat prices, were farming land they did not yet know. They had not grown up reading those particular fence posts on that particular ground. They did not have the accumulated knowledge that Earl Hutchins had on his Champaign County acres. And that ignorance cost them dearly. The farmers who survived, the ones who held on and rebuilt after the Dust Bowl years, were almost universally people who had committed themselves to learning their land with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They learned which direction the first hard north wind came from. They learned how many days usually elapsed between the first killing frost and the first serious snowfall. They learned what the sky looked like in the morning when a blue norther was 2 days away. They learned to check their fence posts in October and to take what they found there seriously. By the late 1940s and through the 1950s, as the plains slowly recovered and farming methods improved, this accumulated knowledge had become a regional cultural inheritance. It was passed from fathers to sons and from mothers to daughters in the same way that it had always been passed. Not in classrooms, not in textbooks, but in the fields, walking the fence lines, watching the animals, reading the sky. A farm boy in Iowa in 1955 would walk the fence line with his father on a November morning the same way that boy's grandfather had walked it with his father in 1920, and the boy would learn the same things. Press the post, feel for movement, check the soil line for cracking. Look at how high the frost has already climbed up the dead grass at the base. The knowledge was unwritten, untested by any laboratory, but it was real and it was functional and it was kept alive by the simple fact that it worked. The question that always arises when we talk about this kind of traditional knowledge is, how accurate was it really? The temptation, looking back from our current vantage point of satellite weather forecasting and supercomputer climate modeling, is to be condescending about what amounts to a man pressing his hand against a piece of wood and making predictions about the next 4 months. But the historical record, examined carefully, does not support condescension. The National Weather Service did not begin providing reliable long-range seasonal outlooks until the mid-20th century. And even then, the forecasts were probabilistic estimates rather than precise predictions. Before that time, the farmers' accumulated local knowledge was genuinely competitive with anything professional meteorology could offer for the specific practical question of whether a particular farm in a particular county was going to face a brutal winter and needed to prepare accordingly. We know this in part because we have the records. County agricultural extension offices, which began expanding in earnest after the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, kept detailed notes on farm conditions, yields, and winter survival outcomes. Researchers who have gone back through those records have found clear patterns showing that farms where the operators were experienced and attentive, where the men and women knew their land in the deep, intimate way we are describing, consistently outperformed neighboring farms in terms of winter preparedness and spring recovery rates, even when controlling for the size and resources of the operation. An experienced farmer who read his fence posts correctly and laid in extra coal and feed was not just acting on a hunch. He was acting on a body of empirical knowledge that was real, even if it was not written down and the outcomes validated the knowledge. This is how folk science works at its best. It is not mystical. It is not superstitious. It is a form of empirical inquiry conducted by people who lack the tools for formal experimentation, but who are sharp enough observers to identify real patterns in the world around them. The equipment itself deserves attention. When we talk about fence posts in this era, we are not talking about the metal T-posts that dominate American fence lines today. We are talking about wooden posts, cedar, locust, Osage orange, hedge apple, oak, that were cut from the farm's own woodlot or bought at the local lumber yard, hand-sharpened at one end and driven into the ground with a post-hole digger and a hand tamper, or in later years, a tractor-mounted post pounder. These posts were organic material buried in soil, subject to rot and moisture and frost in ways that made them exquisitely sensitive to subsurface conditions. Black locust was the gold standard in much of the eastern and central states. It was hard, resistant to rot, and lasted decades in the ground even under harsh conditions. A black locust corner post, set in 1930 and still standing in 1960, had been through 30 winters. It had been pushed and pulled and frozen and thawed 30 times. It sat in the ground with a particular character, a history almost, that an experienced farmer could read. He knew exactly how much that post should move and how much was too much. Cedar posts were common in the Great Plains and the Mountain West. Osage orange, also called hedge apple or bois d'arc, was favored in Kansas and Oklahoma, where it had been planted as windbreaks and living fences across millions of acres in the second half of the 19th century. Osage orange posts were famously dense and hard. The wood would turn the edge of an axe, and they lasted so long in the ground that posts set before the Civil War were still serviceable in the 1930s. The character of the post mattered to the reading. A soft wood post, pine or cottonwood, materials that a poor family might use when they could not afford better, would soak up moisture from the surrounding soil and become heavier as the wet autumn progressed. A hard wood post, locust or Osage orange, would transmit the mechanical movement of the frost heave more directly, the way a rigid conductor transmits a signal better than a flexible one. Experienced farmers knew the difference. They adjusted their reading accordingly. The social dimension of this knowledge is something that is easy to overlook, but was absolutely central to how it functioned. Farming in the era we are describing was not a solitary activity in the way that our popular imagination sometimes pictures it. It was intensely communal, rooted in networks of mutual obligation and information sharing that were as sophisticated in their own way as any modern professional network. The grain elevator was an information exchange as much as it was a commodity market. Farmers who brought their grain to the elevator in the fall, backing their wagons and then their trucks up to the loading dock, waiting their turn, standing in the dusty light while their grain was weighed and sampled, talked to each other in the way that people talk when they are conducting serious business together. They compared notes. How did your corn come in? What did your fence posts look like this fall? Did you see the same thing on your ground that I saw on mine? The general store, before it was replaced by the consolidated supermarket that required a 20-mile drive, was another node in this information network. A hardware store in a farm town in Iowa in 1948 sold fence posts and wire and post drivers and hand tampers, and the man behind the counter knew farming, and the farmers who came in to buy those supplies talked to each other. They compared the observations from their own fence lines the way investors today might compare readings on an economic indicator. A consistent pattern: everyone's posts are moving early this year, the frost is already deeper than it should be in October, was a reliable signal in a way that any one farmer's individual observation could not be. The rural telephone party line, which was a feature of farm life from roughly the 19-teens through the 1950s in most parts of the country, extended this network in ways that were sometimes intrusive and sometimes invaluable. A party line might connect 8 or 10 or 12 farm families on a shared circuit, each with its own distinctive ring, 2 longs and a short, or 3 shorts, or 1 long and 2 shorts, and the entire community knew that anyone could listen in on any call. Privacy was limited, but information moved. A farmer who noticed something unusual on his fence line in October, who was worried enough about it to call a neighbor, was potentially sharing that observation with a dozen families at once. The social pressure against eavesdropping was weak compared to the practical value of knowing what your neighbors were seeing on their land. Women were central to this system in ways that the historical record has often undercounted. The farm wife of this era was not merely a domestic worker who happened to live on a farm. She was a full partner in the agricultural enterprise, and her contributions to the winter preparedness process were essential and often her specific domain of expertise. The cellar, the root cellar, the canning cellar, the cold storage room that every serious farm family maintained beneath or adjacent to the main house, was typically the woman's responsibility to manage and stock. She knew how much food the family needed to survive a winter. She knew how long the preserved goods would last. She did the arithmetic of mouths and months and calories with a precision that was the difference between surviving and not surviving in a bad winter. When Earl Hutchins came home from his November fence line walk and told Dorothy they needed more coal and more dried beans and more cornmeal, Dorothy did not ask him to explain his reasoning. She had been listening to his reasoning and watching him practice it for 30 years of marriage. She knew what it meant when he came home from checking fence posts with that particular set to his jaw. She wrote the list, and she added to it from her own observations: the way the preserves from the summer garden had turned out, the count of quart jars on the cellar shelves, the condition of the salt pork in the barrel, the amount of flour and lard and baking powder that would be needed to keep the family in cornbread and biscuits through 4 or 5 months of cold. The farm wife's knowledge was different from her husband's, but was not subordinate to it. She was reading a different set of instruments, the shelves of the cellar rather than the fence posts of the pasture, but she was engaged in the same fundamental activity of assessment and preparation that kept the family alive. There is a particular category of fence post wisdom that went beyond simple frost heave observation and into something more subtle and more impressive: the reading of post behavior over multiple years as an indicator of long-term change in the land itself. An experienced farmer who had been checking the same fence posts for 20 or 30 years would notice gradual changes in how those posts behaved. A section of fence line that had historically shown moderate frost heave might, over the course of a decade, begin showing increasingly severe heave. This change could indicate any number of things: a rising water table, changes in drainage patterns caused by upstream development or road construction, a gradual shift in soil composition as topsoil eroded and subsoil with different characteristics came closer to the surface, or changes in the microclimate of that particular location caused by the growth of nearby trees. Farmers who noticed these gradual changes would investigate, and the investigation often led to genuinely important discoveries about the changing condition of their land. A fence line that was heaving more severely than it used to was telling the farmer that something had changed underground, and finding out what had changed could reveal a drainage problem, a failing tile line or a shift in the water table that needed to be addressed before it damaged crops or structures. This kind of multi-year, longitudinal observation was something that only long-term residents of the same land could do. It required the accumulated data of decades, stored not in any written record, but in the farmer's own memory, cross-referenced against the physical reality of posts and soil and water. It was a form of monitoring that, in its way, was more sensitive than anything available to most rural families through other means. The transition that began in the 1950s and accelerated through the 1960s, the mechanization of agriculture, the consolidation of small farms into large operations, the arrival of modern weather forecasting on radio and then television, the expansion of the county extension service and its educational programs did not immediately displace this traditional knowledge, but it began to. Slowly at first, then faster. Young men who grew up on farms in the 1950s were the last generation for whom the fence post walk was a standard part of the autumn routine, absorbed as naturally as knowing how to start a tractor or sharpen a plow. Their sons, who grew up on farms in the 1960s and early 70s, were more likely to have grown up with television weather forecasts and extension service publications, and the beginning of the computerized climate modeling that would eventually give us the sophisticated forecasting tools we have today. They still farmed, they still walked fence lines, but the specific practice of reading the posts as a winter forecasting tool was beginning to fade, replaced by other sources of information that were in some ways more precise and in other ways less intimate with the specific ground beneath their feet. The old farmers knew this and were not entirely happy about it. There was a common observation among older men in the farm communities of the 1960s, the kind of thing you heard at the grain elevator or at the hardware store, that the young fellows relied too much on the radio forecasts and not enough on what the land itself was telling them. The radio would tell you what the weather was going to be in the whole region, the whole state, the whole country. But it could not tell you what the frost was doing in your south pasture, on your particular ground with your particular water table. That was knowledge that you could only get by walking out there and pressing your hand against the post yourself. They were right, those old men. They were right in the way that people who have earned their knowledge through decades of hard experience are often right, even when the world is moving past them. The regional forecast was real and useful, but it was not the same thing as the fence post. There is a story, the kind of story that circulates in farm communities, attributed to different families in different places, but always carrying the same essential truth, about two neighbors in a farming county in Nebraska in the winter of 1949 and 50. The names change depending on who is telling the story, but the structure is always the same. Two farms side by side, same soil, same climate, same general conditions. One farmer checks his fence posts in October and finds them moving hard, the frost already deep and the soil saturated. He lays in extra coal, orders more feed, pulls everything into the equipment shed, banks the foundation of every outbuilding with straw bales. His neighbor, a younger man, a veteran of the war who has come back to farming after 5 years away, looks at the same October sky and the same October ground and sees nothing alarming. He orders his usual amount of coal. He leaves his tractor under a canvas tarp in the open yard. The winter of 1949 and 50 is, in fact, severe. Not catastrophic, not the worst winter in Nebraska history by any measure, but colder and longer and snowier than average. In February, the older farmer's coal pile is holding. His equipment starts. His animals are in good condition. His neighbor's coal runs short in the second week of February. His tractor, left outside under its canvas tarp, freezes so hard that the block cracks when he tries to start it in March. The repair bill is the equivalent of several months of farm income. The younger farmer, when the spring finally comes and the damage is totaled, asks his neighbor how he knew. The older man takes him out to the fence line in the south pasture and crouches down beside the post at the far corner. The post is crooked now, pushed up by 2 inches from where it sat in October, the soil cracked around its base. He presses his palm against it. He shows the younger man where to put his hand. He shows him what loose feels like, what tight feels like, what the difference means. That is how the knowledge was transmitted, not in books, not in classrooms. At the base of a fence post, one man's hand guiding another man's hand on a spring morning in Nebraska, with the mud thawing under their boots and the smell of the turned earth rising around them. We live now in a world of extraordinary meteorological precision. The National Weather Service operates a network of thousands of surface observation stations and hundreds of upper air observation sites, feeding data into numerical weather prediction models that run on supercomputers processing millions of calculations per second. Satellites track cloud patterns and sea surface temperatures and snow cover across the entire planet. The 3-month outlook that a farmer in Nebraska can download to his smartphone today is based on more observational data and more sophisticated analysis than anything available to the most experienced farmer of the 1940s could have imagined. And yet, something was lost when the fence post walk disappeared from the American farm routine. Something real and valuable that is not quite captured by the satellite data. A modern corn farmer in Champaign County, Illinois, farming the same black prairie soil that Earl Hutchins farmed in 1947, can pull up a weather app and get a seasonal outlook for the coming winter. What he cannot get from that app is the specific local ground truth reading of what is happening in his particular fields, on his particular soil, with his particular drainage patterns and water table. He cannot feel the frost depth at the corner post of the south pasture. He cannot feel whether this year's heave is different from last year's or from the year before that, in ways that might tell him something specific and local that the regional forecast cannot. The knowledge the old farmers had was calibrated to place in a way that no regional model can be. It was the product of decades of observation on specific ground, and it was exactly as precise as that implies. Extremely precise about a very small area and not transferable to anywhere else. That precision, that place-specific intimacy with the land, was the unique value of the traditional knowledge, and it is the thing that is most completely gone. There are people here and there across rural America who still walk fence lines in October and press their palms against the posts at the corners of their pastures. They are mostly older, mostly people whose grandfathers or fathers walked the same fence lines, mostly people who have farmed the same ground long enough to have developed the kind of accumulated knowledge that makes the reading meaningful. They use the weather app too. They listen to the extension service. They are not Luddites or romantics. They are people who understand that multiple sources of information are better than one, and that a source of information you have developed yourself over decades on ground you know intimately is not something to throw away just because a better general forecast is now available. They will tell you, these men and women, that there is something specific and irreplaceable about putting your hand on that post and feeling what the soil is doing. It connects you to the land in a way that looking at a screen does not. It makes the farm real in your hands in a way that no forecast, however accurate, can quite replicate. The fence post is not just an instrument, it is a relationship, a conversation between the farmer and the land that has been going on since the first European settlers drove the first wooden stakes into American soil and learned, slowly and sometimes at terrible cost, to listen to what the ground had to say. That conversation is part of the inheritance that the farming families of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s passed down to us, not in textbooks but in the muscle memory of a hand pressed against weathered wood on a cold October morning, reading a message written in the language of frost and soil and water and the slow, relentless work of a hard winter coming in. And that is a conversation worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If this story connected with you, if it reminded you of a grandparent, a parent, a piece of land, or a way of knowing the world that we have almost lost, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button because it helps more people find content like this. And if you know someone who grew up on a farm, someone who would appreciate this kind of history, please share this video with them. These stories belong to all of us, and the more people who hear them, the longer they will live. This video is inspired by real events and real agricultural practices documented throughout American farming history from the 1930s through the 1970s. It does not intend to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Earl Hutchins is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced exactly these situations during this era. Men and women whose names were never recorded, but whose knowledge and resilience shaped the rural communities that are still the backbone of this country. We honor their memory and their wisdom.